The moment Jonas Shepard reached across the long oak table and took Matilda Hart's hand in his rough, calloused grip, the entire room went silent. Not the polite kind of silence that falls over a crowd when someone clears their throat and calls for order. This was the thunderstruck kind, the kind that happens when something so unexpected, so raw and unguarded, happens in front of a roomful of people who had all come expecting a very different outcome. The land commissioner, a red-faced man named Gerald Purvis who smelled of hair tonic and railroad money, actually stopped mid-sentence. The quill in his hand hovered over the ledger like a vulture frozen in the sky. Matilda's fingers had been trembling. She had pressed them flat against the table to hide it, but Jonas had seen. He always saw the things she tried to hide. She looked at him. His jaw was set hard, his dark eyes steady beneath the brim of the hat he'd removed out of respect for the proceedings, though respect was the last thing this room deserved. There was a bruise forming below his left cheekbone from where Deputy Alcott's fist had connected with his face not 40 minutes ago, when Jonas had shoved his way through the courthouse doors after someone had told him what was happening inside. The bruise was purple and swelling, and it made him look like a man who had already been in one war today and was entirely prepared to start another. He did not look at Gerald Purvis. He did not look at the railroad's hired lawyer, who sat at the far end of the table with a stack of forged documents and the smug smile of a man who had never once lost a land dispute in the territory of Kansas. Jonas looked only at Matilda, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet and certain in the way that earthquakes are quiet just before the ground opens up. "I am not letting go today," he said. Matilda Hart had come to Caldwell, Kansas in the spring of 1878 with $17, a carpetbag, and a deed to 340 acres of land that had been left to her by her father, Earl Hart, who had died of pneumonia the previous November without ever setting foot on the land himself. Earl Hart had been a dreamer. He had purchased that parcel of prairie through a government land grant program, had talked about it for years at the dinner table in their narrow row house in St. Louis, had spread hand-drawn maps across the kitchen counter, and pointed at lines that meant nothing to Matilda's younger eyes, but had slowly, over the years, come to mean everything. He had never made it to Kansas. A wet winter, a weakening chest, and a stubborn refusal to see a doctor had seen to that. And so when the lawyers read the will, everything Earl Hart had dreamed of became Matilda's burden and Matilda's inheritance in the same breath. She was 27 years old. She had worked as a seamstress in St. Louis, had managed the accounts for her father's small tailoring shop, had never owned anything more substantial than a sewing machine and a good wool coat. She had no husband. She had an aunt in Cincinnati who wrote letters that were long on advice and short on affection. She had, as far as she could count, no real reasons to stay in St. Louis and exactly one reason to go west: the land. The train from St. Louis to Wichita took 3 days and 2 nights, and Matilda spent most of it sitting upright in a hard wooden seat, reading the deed over and over as if the words might change if she stopped looking at them. Section 14, Township 29, Range 3 West, 340 acres. Hers. She arrived in Wichita in early April, took a connecting stage south to Caldwell, and checked into the Drover's Rest Hotel, which was the cleanest of 3 options and which had the added benefit of being operated by a woman, a wide-shouldered Norwegian named Ingrid Halvorsen, who took one look at Matilda's carpetbag and her city shoes and said, without cruelty but without softness either, "You will need boots, and you will need them quickly." Matilda bought boots. She also bought a second-hand rifle she barely knew how to fire, a canvas water bag, and a territory map from the general store. She spent 3 days in Caldwell asking questions of anyone who would answer them, learning the names of her neighboring landowners, the condition of the creek that ran through the southern end of her property, the history of the land itself. It was on the second day of questions that she first heard the name Jonas Shepard. "Shepard's ranch borders yours to the north," said Emmett Cole, the land surveyor, who had a gray beard and the careful manner of a man who had seen too many land disputes to have opinions about any of them. "Runs cattle, has for 12 years. Good man. Quiet man. Lost his wife 4 years back. Keeps to himself mostly, but he knows that stretch of country better than anyone alive." "Is he trustworthy?" Matilda asked. Emmett Cole considered this the way he considered most things, slowly and with his eyes directed somewhere middle distance. "As trustworthy as a man can be out here," he said finally, which Matilda understood to mean yes, with conditions she had not yet learned. She rode out to her land for the first time on a Thursday morning, borrowing a horse from Ingrid Halvorson's husband, Lars, who was generous with his animals and sparing with his words. The prairie was still winter-brown in patches, but the first green was pushing up through the dead grass, and the sky was so enormous that Matilda sat her horse at the top of the first gentle rise and simply stared at it for a long time, her heart doing something complicated in her chest that she could not quite name. She was still staring when she heard the horse behind her. He came up from the north, riding a big roan mare, moving at an easy trot that slowed to a walk when he spotted her. He was wearing a dark canvas coat and a weather-stained hat, and even from a distance she could see the economy of movement that spoke of a man entirely comfortable in his body and his landscape. He pulled up about 20 feet away and tipped his hat with one finger. "You must be Miss Hart," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected, roughened by years of open air. "I am," she said, "and you must be Jonas Shepard." Something shifted in his expression, a faint surprise that she knew his name, and then a kind of settling as if he'd decided something in the space of a second. "Word travels," he said. "It does," she agreed. "You know this land." "I do." "Then I'd like your honest opinion of it," she said. "Not what it's worth in dollars, what it's worth in truth." He looked at her for a moment in a way she would come to recognize over time, that careful, measuring look that was not unkind but was entirely serious. Then he dismounted in a single fluid motion and walked toward her, and for the first time she saw his face clearly. He was somewhere in his late 30s, she judged. Sun-darkened, with deep lines at the corners of his eyes and a jaw that seemed to have been carved out of the same stubborn material as the country around them. There was something in his eyes, dark brown and very direct, that made her feel simultaneously seen and unsettled. "Honest opinion," he said, turning to look out across the land. "Good soil in the south quarter. Creeks reliable except in August, sometimes July if it's dry. North section has some rocky ground but it drains well, and there's a natural windbreak in the tree line that would shelter a house site nicely. The grass comes in strong in a good year. In a bad year this whole county looks like the moon." He paused. "Your father had good instincts for a man who never saw it. You knew my father chose this land." "Emmett Cole talks more than he thinks he does," Jonas said, and there was the ghost of something at the corner of his mouth that wasn't quite a smile but suggested it knew where smiles lived. Matilda looked back out at the land. 340 acres of sky and grass and possibility and difficulty, and something cold and knotted in her chest loosened just slightly, the way ice begins to loosen in a creek in early spring, not gone yet but beginning to move. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for the honest opinion." "It's what you asked for," he said simply. He remounted and rode north toward his own land, and she watched him go until the grass swallowed him up. And she thought, in a way she would not examine closely for a long time, that the land felt less frightening with a man like that at its border. The first real difficulty arrived 6 weeks later, in the form of a letter from the Transcontinental Land and Mineral Company, which was the official name of what everyone in Caldwell privately called the railroad's land arm. The letter was written in the formal, airless language of legal documents, but its meaning was as plain and hard as a rifle barrel pressed against a door. The company claimed prior rights to a portion of Matilda's land, specifically the eastern 120 acres, on the basis of a government survey error that had allegedly been corrected in their favor in 1875, before Earl Hart's grant had been issued. Matilda read the letter twice, then folded it very precisely and set it on the table in her hotel room and sat with her hands in her lap for a long time. Then she went to find Emmett Cole. Emmett studied the letter with the reading glasses he only wore in private and a deepening frown. "This is Fletcher Kane's work," he said at last. "He's the company's lawyer. He's done this in 3 other counties. Usually the landowner gives up or the paperwork disappears." "I won't give up," Matilda said. Emmett looked at her over his glasses. "Miss Hart, Fletcher Kane has the resources of a railroad behind him and contacts in the territorial government. Winning against him isn't impossible, but it requires a land hearing before the county commissioner, and those hearings are not always conducted in good faith." "Schedule the hearing," she said. Emmett scheduled the hearing. Then, in the way that men of his particular type tend to do when they sense a thing is about to go badly, he also quietly, without being asked, let Jonas Shepard know what was happening. Jonas came to her the next morning. She was at her land by then, living in the temporary structure she'd had built in April, a 1-room wood-frame cabin with a sod roof, and a fireplace that drew properly only when the wind was right. She was mending a section of fence along the creek when she heard his horse, and she straightened and shaded her eyes and watched him ride up with the same careful, unhurried way he had about him. "Emmett told me," he said without preamble. "It's my problem to handle," she said. "I know it is," he said. "I'm not here to take it from you. I'm here because I've watched Fletcher Kane operate in this county for 4 years, and there are things you need to know that Emmett won't tell you because he thinks knowing them will frighten you off." She lowered her hand and met his eyes squarely. "Then tell me." He dismounted, looped his reins over a fence post, and sat down on the top rail with the ease of a man comfortable in any position, and he told her. He told her that Gerald Purvis, the county land commissioner who would run the hearing, had received a land grant of his own 3 years ago from a subsidiary of the Transcontinental Land and Mineral Company. He told her that Fletcher Kane had a habit of making key documents disappear from the county courthouse records room before hearings, and that 2 landowners who had contested the company's claims in the past 2 years had both had unexplained fires on their properties the week before their hearings. He told her that the company wanted her eastern 120 acres because a survey crew had quietly determined that there was a viable route for a rail spur running across it, and that once the railroad came through, that land would be worth 10 times what it was worth today. He told her all of this quietly, looking not at her but at the creek running bright in the morning sun, and when he was done he said, "You needed to know what you're walking into." She was quiet for a moment. She had not, she discovered, been frightened by any of it. Something in her had absorbed the information and processed it into something harder and more useful than fear. "What did the other landowners do wrong?" she asked. He looked at her then, and there it was again, that measuring look, but this time something else was in it too, something she could not name. "They went to the hearing alone," he said, "and they couldn't prove their documents were real because the company had replaced the courthouse copies with altered versions. So I need to have my documents certified and witnessed before the hearing," she said. "By multiple parties," he said. "Yes. And I need witnesses who aren't afraid of the company at the hearing itself," she said. "Yes." She looked at him directly. "Will you be one of them?" The pause before he answered was not a hesitation, she understood later. It was the pause of a man who was already certain of his answer and was simply letting himself feel the weight of it. "Yes," he said. She nodded once crisply and picked up her mending tools. "Then we have work to do," she said, and the look of surprise on Jonas Shepard's face was brief but real and, she thought privately, rather satisfying. Over the next 6 weeks, as the date of the hearing drew closer, they worked. They worked on the legal preparation, visiting Emmett Cole together, making copies of the land deed, and having them witnessed and sealed by the county clerk, Matilda's pastor from Caldwell's Methodist Church, and a retired federal surveyor named Augustus Pratt who had known Earl Hart in passing and was willing to provide a sworn statement about the legitimacy of the original land grant. They visited two neighboring landowners, the Vasquez family to the south, whose patriarch, Rodrigo Vasquez, had lost a quarter section to the company 2 years ago and was burning with a quiet, controlled fury about it, and the Kleins to the east, a German immigrant couple who had their own land grant paperwork and their own suspicions about the company's methods. And as they worked, they learned each other. It happened in the way those things happen between serious people who are engaged in serious tasks, not through soft conversation or deliberate courtship, but through the accumulation of small, true moments. Matilda learned that Jonas had come to Kansas from Tennessee at the age of 26, that he had built his ranch from literally nothing, a single horse, $60, and a year of working other men's cattle before he'd saved enough to buy his own land. She learned that his wife, Clara, had died of diphtheria in the winter of 1874, leaving him with a 4-year-old son named Daniel who was now 8 and who lived with Jonas on the ranch and attended the school in Caldwell 3 days a week. She learned that Jonas's silences were not empty but full, that he was a man who did not speak unless he had something worth saying, and that when he did speak it was worth listening to. She learned that he could be funny, in a dry and understated way that crept up on her sideways and left her smiling when she wasn't expecting to. Jonas learned that Matilda was not what she appeared to be on first impression. She appeared, on the surface, to be a composed and practical woman, which she was. But beneath the composure was something fierce and determined that he recognized because he had it himself. That particular stubbornness that is not pig-headedness, but rather the deep conviction that the right thing is worth fighting for even when the fight is expensive. He learned that she had taught herself basic surveying from a library book on the train west and could read a land plat as well as any professional. He learned that she missed her father with a grief that was still sharp and raw, that she was building this land not just for herself, but as a kind of argument she was having with the universe on his behalf. He learned that she had a way of standing very still when she was thinking, utterly still, like a bird before it flies, and that this stillness preceded insights that were usually better than anything he'd thought of first. He also learned, in a gradual and initially unwelcome way, that she was taking up more and more space in his thoughts. He noticed the exact moment it became impossible to pretend otherwise. They were at the creek on a late June evening, going over Emmett Cole's survey notes by the light of a lantern, the sun going down in an extravagance of orange and pink behind them. And Matilda read something in the notes that was wrong and said so, her finger running along a line of text, her face close to the paper, her voice taking on that quick, precise quality it got when she was certain of something. And Jonas looked at her, at the line of her jaw, and the way a piece of dark hair had come loose from her pin and curved against her cheek, and something in his chest moved with a force that alarmed him. He said nothing. He looked back at the notes. He said, "You're right, that number is wrong," and they corrected it together, and then he rode home and sat on his porch for a long time in the dark, listening to the coyotes and the distant cattle and the voice of a man who had spent 4 years telling himself he was done with that particular territory of feeling. He ignored the voice. He went back the next morning, because there was work to do and because, at a level he was still not entirely ready to examine, he could not make himself stay away. Daniel, his son, met Matilda for the first time in mid-June when Jonas brought him along on a Saturday morning visit to the property. Daniel was a compact, serious boy with Jonas's dark eyes and a habit of watching strangers very carefully before deciding what to do about them. He watched Matilda for about 10 minutes while she and Jonas talked, then walked directly up to her and said, "Can you bake?" Matilda looked down at him with an expression that Jonas privately found extraordinary, a mixture of amusement and genuine interest that was completely unforced. "I can," she said. "Can you?" Daniel appeared to find this question genuinely surprising. "I'm 8, he said. "That's old enough to learn," she said. "Do you want to?" He thought about it with the gravity of someone making a significant decision. "Maybe," he said. Jonas watched this exchange and felt something move in him that was different from what he'd felt the night before at the creek. That had been wanting. This was something more complicated, something that looked ahead in a way he had been refusing to look ahead for 4 years. He deliberately did not think about it for the rest of the day, which meant he thought about it constantly. The weeks leading up to the hearing were tense in the specific way that the weeks before a battle are tense, when everything is prepared and checked and prepared again, and there is nothing left to do but wait and hold your nerve. Fletcher Kane's men came by Matilda's property twice, once ostensibly to resurvey the eastern boundary, which Matilda refused to allow without Emmett Cole present, and once under no pretext at all, simply 2 large men on horses who sat on the road and looked at the property for a long time before riding away. The implicit message was transparent as glass. Matilda watched them go and felt something cold and hard settle in her stomach. Then she went back inside and reread her documents for the 40th time. The night before the hearing, Jonas came by late, after Daniel was in bed at the ranch, and Matilda's lantern was still burning in the window of her cabin. He knocked on the door and she opened it immediately, as if she'd been expecting him, which she had been, though she couldn't have said how she knew. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "Ask me something harder," she said, and stood back to let him in. He came in and sat at the small table, and she poured him coffee from the pot she kept on the fireplace crane, and they sat across from each other in the small, warm light, and for a while neither of them spoke. The prairie wind moved against the cabin walls, and somewhere far off a night bird called once and went quiet. "You know they may have got to Purvis already," Jonas said finally. "The hearing may be decided before it starts." "I know," she said. "If Purvis rules against you, the next step is the federal courts, and that takes money and time and Jonas," she said. He stopped. "I know all of this," she said, quietly but with precision. "I have thought about every version of tomorrow and what comes after. I am not going to that hearing tomorrow without knowing the risks. What I need from you right now is not a recitation of everything that might go wrong." She paused. "I just need to know you'll be there." He looked at her across the table for a long moment, and the lantern light made his face amber and shadow, and his dark eyes were very steady and very warm, and he said, "I will be there." And she heard in those 4 words something that was not just about a hearing. She heard it, and she did not look away, and for a moment the air between them held something significant and unnamed, and then she looked down at her coffee cup, and he cleared his throat, and they talked for another hour about practical things, about the order of the hearing, about what Rodrigo Vasquez would say, and what Augustus Pratt's signed statements would accomplish. And by the time he left, the night was dark and cool and full of stars. And Matilda stood in her doorway and watched his lantern move away north until it was swallowed by the dark, and she pressed her hand against the doorframe and felt her heart doing that complicated thing again, the thing she was almost ready to name. The day of the hearing arrived with an insolent blue sky, hot and clear, the kind of perfect Kansas summer day that felt designed to mock the proceedings happening beneath it. Matilda dressed carefully. She wore her good gray dress, the one she'd had made in St. Louis for church and serious occasions, and she braided her dark hair and pinned it back and put on her good boots, the Caldwell ones, not the city ones, because she was not a city woman anymore and hadn't been since April, though perhaps she'd never truly been one. She arrived at the courthouse 30 minutes early. Rodrigo Vasquez was already there, standing in the street with his hat in his hands, his dark face composed and tightly controlled. The Kleins came 5 minutes later, both of them, which surprised Matilda because she had not been certain they would come. Augustus Pratt arrived with a leather satchel full of documents and the look of a man going into a legal fight he'd been waiting 3 years to have. Jonas arrived last, which surprised her, and then she saw why. He had with him a man she didn't recognize, a broad-shouldered man in a federal marshal's badge, who dismounted alongside Jonas and shook Matilda's hand and introduced himself as Marshal Henry Dowd, out of the federal district in Wichita. She looked at Jonas. "I wrote to him 3 weeks ago," Jonas said. "I told him what was happening here. He came on his own authority, a pause. It can't hurt to have a federal officer present. No, she said softly, looking at him. It cannot. He met her eyes briefly, and there was something in his that he dropped quickly back behind his usual composed expression. But she had seen it, and filed it away in the place where she kept things she was not yet ready to deal with but absolutely intended to. They went in. The courthouse meeting room was not large. It had a long oak table, 6 chairs on each side, and a raised platform at the head where Gerald Purvis sat behind a smaller table with his ledger and his quill. Fletcher Kane sat at the far end of the main table, flanked by 2 associates, and a stack of documents that were held together with red ribbon and smelled of intimidation. He was a lean man in his 40s, impeccably dressed in a black suit that had never seen a moment of honest physical labor, with pale gray eyes that moved over the room with the quick efficiency of a man cataloging obstacles. His eyes paused on Matilda. They paused on Rodrigo Vasquez, Emmett Cole, the Kleins. They lingered on Marshall Dowd in a way that was very brief but spoke volumes. Then they moved on, and his face remained pleasantly neutral, which was the most threatening thing Matilda had yet seen that day. She took her seat. Emmett Cole sat beside her. Rodrigo Vasquez and the Kleins took seats along the wall. Augustus Pratt sat next to Emmett. Marshall Dowd stood near the door, not seated, not part of the proceeding, just present, which was the whole point. Jonas sat down next to Matilda, on her left, close enough that his arm was warm against hers, and he put his hat on the table and looked forward with the face of a man prepared to be there for however long it took. Purvis opened the proceedings. He had the air of a man who had come in with a decision already made and was going through the formalities of appearing to listen. He allowed Fletcher Kane to speak first, which was itself an irregularity that Emmett Cole noted quietly in his record book. Kane spoke for 20 minutes in the smooth, authoritative tone of a man who had spoken in courtrooms for years, presenting the company's claim to the eastern 120 acres, citing the 1875 survey correction, producing documents with the correct official seals, speaking of government process and legal precedent with the easy confidence of someone who had bought both. Matilda listened and kept her face entirely still and felt the cold thing settle deeper in her stomach. Then Emmett Cole spoke. He was precise and methodical, which was his nature, and he presented Matilda's documents. The original land grant deed, the certified copies witnessed by 4 separate parties, Augustus Pratt's sworn statement regarding the legitimacy of the original survey. Pratt himself then spoke, producing his own professional survey records from 1873, predating the company's claimed correction by 2 years, showing clearly that the land in question had been properly delineated in Earl Hart's favor from the beginning. Kane objected. Purvis sustained it. Emmett pressed forward. Kane objected again. Purvis was less certain this time, his eyes moving to Marshall Dowd near the door and then back to the table with something complicated in them. Then something happened that had not been in any of the plans. Deputy Alcott, a local man who had been in the company's pocket for 2 years, came through the side door with a folder of papers that he placed in front of Purvis, and Purvis picked them up and announced that new evidence had been submitted, documents from the Territorial Land Office in Topeka that allegedly supported the company's claim. Emmett Cole stood immediately. "I would like to examine those documents," he said. "That is not procedure at this stage," Purvis said. "Then suspend procedure," Emmett said, with a firmness that surprised even Matilda, "because those documents did not exist yesterday, and I would very much like to know where they came from." The room erupted. Matilda's heart was hammering. She looked at the documents in Purvis's hands and felt the certainty, cold and solid as iron, that they were forged, that this was the move Kane had been holding back, the final card that was supposed to end this before it could go any further. She looked at Jonas, who had leaned slightly forward, his hands flat on the table, watching Purvis with a focused, dangerous attention. It was in the chaos of raised voices and Purvis's increasingly desperate attempts to restore order that Deputy Alcott did something stupid. He was nervous. She could see it, the sweat on his upper lip, the way his eyes kept moving to Fletcher Kane for direction. And nervous men who are not intelligent men tend to escalate when they should be still. He moved toward Matilda, not to threaten her exactly, but to physically pressure her away from the table, a massive and illegal overreach that she recognized even as it was happening. She did not move. She braced her hands on the table and held her ground and said, "You will not touch me." Alcott grabbed her arm. Jonas was out of his chair before anyone else moved, and Alcott, who outweighed Jonas by 40 pounds and had the criminal advantage of a badge, swung wildly with his free hand and connected with Jonas's face, the crack of it silencing the room again instantly. Jonas staggered, caught himself on the table edge, and stood upright, and the look on his face was not anger exactly but something harder and colder than anger, a kind of reckoning. Marshal Dowd crossed the room in 3 strides and put himself between Alcott and both of them, and his voice, when he spoke, was the voice of federal authority in a room that had just remembered what that meant. "Deputy," he said, "you will stand down." Now Alcott stood down. Purvis was the color of an unripe tomato. The room was breathless. Fletcher Kane sat at the end of the table with his pleasantly neutral expression intact but his pale gray eyes working hard. And Jonas Shepard, with blood beginning to track from the corner of his mouth and a bruise already rising on his cheekbone, looked at Matilda, who was still braced against the table, her arm throbbing where Alcott had grabbed it, her whole body rigid with the effort of maintaining composure in the face of every force in this room that wanted her to break. He looked at her and he reached across the table and he took her hand in his and he held it and he said it quietly just to her, but in the ringing silence of that aftermath everyone in the room heard it. "I'm not letting go today." She looked at him. Her jaw was trembling slightly, just slightly, and her eyes were very bright and she thought, this is what it means. Not flowers or soft words or the easy kind of feelings that cost nothing. This. A man with a bruise on his face and blood at his mouth who came anyway, who is here anyway, who is holding on. She turned her hand over and gripped his back, and something in her that had been holding itself together by pure will since April finally, carefully, began to ease. Marshal Dowd moved to the head of the table. He addressed Purvis with the particular precision of a man who has spent his career navigating corrupt local governance. He informed him that he had, in his possession, a letter from the territorial governor's office in Topeka, authorizing federal review of any proceedings related to the transcontinental land and mineral company's land claims in Sumner County, following complaints filed by multiple landowners, including Rodrigo Vasquez, the Kleins, and 3 others Matilda had not known about. He produced this letter and placed it on the table in front of Purvis with a quiet finality that was more devastating than any raised voice could have been. The hearing did not end immediately. There were another 2 hours of procedural argument, of Kane's increasingly strained objections, of Emmett Cole presenting documents and Pratt presenting surveys and Purvis slowly, visibly, recalculating his loyalties in the face of federal authority. Rodrigo Vasquez stood and spoke in clear, controlled English about what the company had already taken from his family and what it was attempting to take from Matilda Hart, and his voice was quiet and steady and absolutely devastating in its precision. Throughout all of it, Jonas held Matilda's hand. He did not make a production of it. He simply held it, warm and solid and certain, and she held his, and the fact of that grip was the steadiest thing in the room. When Purvis finally ruled, it was an adjournment, not a decision, pending federal review of the documents provided by both sides. It was not a victory and it was not a defeat. It was a delay, and in the specific mathematics of this situation, a delay was equivalent to a victory because Matilda's documents were legitimate and the company's new documents were not. and with federal oversight now in place, the space for those documents to do their forged work had collapsed. Fletcher Kane left without speaking to anyone. His neutral expression was still in place, but something behind his pale eyes had shifted, had recalculated, had moved on to whatever was next. He was not finished, Matilda knew that. Men like Fletcher Kane were never finished after one hearing. But he was not winning today, and today was what mattered. They came out of the courthouse into the hot blue afternoon, and Rodrigo Vasquez shook Matilda's hand and held it a moment and said, quietly, "Your father would have been proud." And she had to look away to compose herself. The Kleins said thank you in English and then something else in German, which Emmett translated later as something like "May your ground stay firm." Augustus Pratt packed his satchel with the satisfied efficiency of a man whose expertise had mattered. Marshal Dowd spoke to Jonas for a few minutes off to the side, and Matilda watched them, the marshal's serious face, Jonas's careful nod, the exchange of information between two men who had both, for their own reasons, decided this mattered enough to fight. Then Dowd tipped his hat to Matilda, mounted his horse, and rode toward the north road back to Wichita. Matilda stood in the street in the hot afternoon sun with her good gray dress and her Caldwell boots and the deed to 340 acres in her satchel, and she breathed, carefully, in and out. Jonas came to stand beside her. His hat was back on his head and someone had given him a cloth for his face and he had pressed it against his lip and it had helped some. The bruise on his cheekbone was spectacular. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "Good," she said. "It means you're real." He turned to look at her and she was already looking at him and neither of them pretended there was nothing in it. "Matilda," he said. "Not today," she said gently. "Let me have today first, just this for today." He understood. She needed the moment to be what it was before it became something else, something more. He nodded and looked back out at the street, and they stood side by side in the afternoon sun, two people who had just fought something real together and survived it, and the space between them was full and warm and patient. They went back to her land separately. She rode alone, which was what she needed, and she stopped at the top of the rise where she had stopped the first day and looked out at all of it, the creek catching light in the south, the tree line along the north, the long golden grass moving in the wind. 340 acres. Hers. Her father's voice came to her in the specific way grief works, not as a ghost or a sensation, but as a particular quality of knowing. He had looked at maps on a kitchen table in St. Louis and dreamed this. She was in it. She allowed herself to cry for about 3 minutes. Then she wiped her face with the back of her hand and rode down into her land. Over the following weeks, the federal review proceeded with the grinding slowness of bureaucratic process, and Matilda threw herself into the work of her property with the energy of someone who had been sitting still too long. She was not sitting still anymore. She hired 2 hands from Caldwell, a young man named Pete who was 19 and eager and not yet skilled, and an older man named Calhoun who had been ranching since before the war and who looked at her sideways for about a week before deciding she was worth working for. She planted a kitchen garden. She began the foundation work for a proper house, not the cabin, which was adequate but temporary, but something intended to last. Jonas helped with the foundation work. He did not offer exactly. He simply arrived one morning with tools and his knowledge of the land's composition, and said he'd spotted a better site for the foundation than the one she'd marked, 40 feet to the east where the ground was higher and drained better. And she went and looked at it and he was right. And so they adjusted the plans and he stayed and worked. He was there 3 or 4 days a week, and Daniel came on Saturdays, and Daniel did indeed begin to learn to bake, in Matilda's cabin with her small Dutch oven and a bag of flour from the Caldwell General Store. He was methodical and serious about it in a way that Matilda found entirely charming, measuring things precisely and consulting her in the tone of a professional seeking technical advice. "Is it enough flour?" he would ask. "Check the texture," she would say. "What does it feel like?" He would press the dough with 2 fingers and think about it. "Still sticky," he would say. "Then add a little more." He made biscuits 3 Saturdays running before they were consistently good, and when they finally were, he presented them to Jonas at dinner with the satisfaction of a craftsman delivering finished work. Jonas bit into one and said, "These are better than mine," which was both honest and, Matilda noted, entirely the right thing to say. She watched Jonas with his son and learned something important about him, something that the work and the hearing and the serious practical conversations had not shown her. With Daniel he was different, not different in character but different in dimension. The full warmth of him that was usually kept banked and controlled opened up in those interactions. The easy affection, the patient explanations, the humor that was no longer just dry and understated but genuinely playful. He was a good father. He was a good man. She was falling in love with him, had been falling in love with him probably since the creek on that June evening when he was right about the survey number and she had seen his profile in the lantern light, and the falling was proceeding with the inevitability of water finding low ground. She did not hurry it. There was time. There was, for the first time in her life, the particular luxury of time on her own land. The federal ruling came down in early September. It was definitive. Matilda Hart's title to all 340 acres was confirmed and legally protected. The Transcontinental Land and Mineral Company's claim was rejected. The documents produced by Deputy Alcott at the hearing were found to be fraudulent, and the matter was referred to the federal attorney's office in Topeka for further action. Gerald Purvis resigned his position as county commissioner within a week, preemptively, before anyone could make him. Deputy Alcott left Caldwell entirely, which was wise. Fletcher Kane did not leave the territory, but he moved his operations north, toward a county where the federal attention was not yet focused. He was, Matilda thought, exactly the kind of problem that moved rather than dissolved, but he had moved away from her, and for now that was enough. Emmett Cole brought her the official ruling papers on a Tuesday morning, arriving at her property with the documents sealed and the solemn pleasure of a man who had been keeping himself from hoping and had now, reluctantly, been proven wrong to restrain his hope. She read it standing in the morning sun, and when she lowered it she looked out at her land and said, quite simply, "Thank you, Papa." She wrote to Emmett a proper letter of thanks. She wrote to Marshall Dowd. She wrote to Augustus Pratt. She paid Rodrigo Vasquez's son for 2 days of fence work she had already intended to pay for, and added something extra, which she did not tell Rodrigo about. And then she rode north to Jonas's ranch. She had been there before, a few times, on practical errands, to return a tool or discuss a shared boundary question. She knew the layout of it, the long, low ranch house, the barn, the corrals where the cattle moved in the late afternoon light. She arrived in the early evening when the sun was getting low, and Daniel was in the barn doing his evening chores and Jonas was at the corral, leaning on the fence rail watching a young horse he'd been working with. He heard her approach and turned, and she did not give him time to prepare for what she was about to say because she had prepared for long enough. "The ruling came through," she said. "It's mine." All of it. The look that moved across his face was something she would remember for the rest of her life. It was not just relief or satisfaction. It was something deeper, something that had been held very tightly for a very long time, releasing all at once, quiet and complete. "Good," he said, and his voice was rough on it. "Jonas," she said. She was off her horse now, the reins looped over her arm. "I need to tell you something, and I'm going to tell you plainly because I don't see the point of being any other way about it." He turned fully to face her, one arm still on the fence rail, his dark eyes on her face. "I love you," she said. "I have been trying not to say it for months because there was too much else happening and it didn't seem like the right time, but the ruling came today and the land is mine and I am standing here saying it plainly. I love you, Jonas Shepard, and I think you know it, and I think you feel the same way, and if I'm wrong I will apologize and we can pretend this didn't happen, but I don't think I'm wrong." The silence after she finished was about 4 seconds long. 4 seconds was a very long time. Then Jonas Shepard pushed off the fence rail, crossed the distance between them in 2 strides, cupped her face in both of his rough, calloused, work-weathered hands and kissed her. And it was exactly the kind of kiss that could only come from months of want and restraint and careful patience finally given permission. When they stopped, they were both breathing differently, and the evening light was gold and long across the grass, and somewhere in the barn Daniel was whistling something tuneless to the horses. "You're not wrong," Jonas said. His voice was very low. "You have not been wrong since about the 2nd week I knew you," she laughed. It was a real laugh, full and surprised, and he smiled, a complete smile, not the ghost she'd been catching for months but the real thing, and it transformed his face in a way that made her reach up and put her hand against his jaw carefully, avoiding the cheekbone that was still faintly yellowed with the last of the hearing's bruise. "I thought I was done with it," he said, honestly, because honesty was what they did. "After Clara, I told myself I was done." "I know," she said. "I didn't fight it very hard," he admitted. "No," she agreed, "you didn't." He turned his face slightly into her hand and said nothing for a moment, and she felt the warmth of him, the solid reality of him against her palm. "Stay for supper," he said finally. "I had planned to," she said. He laughed at that, a brief, genuine sound, and took her hand and led her toward the ranch house, and she went with him through the golden evening, and it was simple and it was right. The months that followed were full and good in the way that things that have been hard-won are full and good. Matilda's house went up in the fall, properly this time. 2 rooms with a proper roof, and a good stone fireplace and windows that let in the morning light. Calhoun and Pete stayed on as her hands, and she hired a 3rd man in the spring, a quiet Osage man named Thomas who knew the land and the water and the weather in a way that came from generations of knowledge, and who was precise and reliable, and turned out to share Matilda's appreciation for a direct conversation over a vague one. She and Jonas did not rush. They had both learned the value of patience, of letting things be what they were before demanding them to become something else. He came to her property often and she went to his, and on Sundays they frequently took Daniel between them on rides across both properties, which connected along the northern creek in a way that Jonas pointed out, with deliberate neutrality, would make excellent combined pasture for a larger herd. "Is that a practical observation or something else?" she asked. "It can be both," he said. Daniel, who was 9 now and had reached the age of opinions, looked between them and said, "Are you going to get married?" with the directness of a child who finds adult circumlocution irritating. Jonas said, "Daniel," Matilda said, "I'm waiting to be asked." There was a silence. Jonas looked at her with an expression that was equally mortified and delighted. Daniel looked satisfied, as if his work here was done. "You could ask her now," Daniel suggested helpfully. "Thank you," Jonas said, in a tone that suggested the conversation was over. But Matilda was smiling, and she did not stop smiling for most of the ride home. He asked her in November, which was precisely long enough after Daniel's unsolicited suggestion that it did not appear to have been precipitated by it, though she privately thought it had moved something along. He did it at her house, at her table in the evening after supper, with no ceremony but with a ring that had been his grandmother's, a small and simple gold band that he had carried from Tennessee, and that he had kept in a box in his dresser drawer for 4 years without being able to look at it directly. He set it on the table in front of her and said, "Matilda Hart, I want to ask you to be my wife. You don't have to answer right now, and you don't have to say yes, but I want you to know that if you say yes, I will spend the rest of my life being worthy of it." She looked at the ring for a moment and then at him. "Jonas Shepard," she said. "Yes." He breathed out, a long, quiet breath, like a man who has been holding something carefully for a long time and has finally set it down in a safe place. She picked up the ring and put it on herself, which made him laugh in surprise, and then he reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and they sat like that for a long time in the warmth of her fireplace, which was a very good fireplace, drawing properly regardless of the wind direction, because she had insisted on it, and Calhoun had found a builder who understood her requirements. They were married in the spring of 1879 in the Methodist Church in Caldwell, on a Saturday afternoon with the windows open to the prairie air. It was a small ceremony. Emmett Cole came, and Rodrigo Vasquez and his wife, and the Kleins, and Ingrid Havorson from the Drovers' Rest, and Thomas and Pete and Calhoun, and Augustus Pratt, who drove a considerable distance to be there, and said it was worth every mile. Daniel stood beside his father at the front of the church and took his role with the gravity of someone who understood that this was a significant thing and intended to honor it. Matilda wore a blue dress she had made herself, the best sewing she had ever done, with small pearl buttons down the front and a proper fitted waist, and she carried a bunch of wild prairie flowers that she had cut from the field along the creek that morning, and she walked down the aisle without anyone to escort her because her father was gone, and there was no one else she would have chosen, and she had decided that she would escort herself, which was Jonas thought when he saw her walking toward him. Entirely and perfectly right. The pastor said the words, and they said the words back, and Jonas put the ring on her finger this time, which felt right too, and she put a plain band on his that she had bought herself, and the church was full of the kind of small, practical happiness that outlasts the more spectacular varieties. They had a supper at the Drovers' Rest after, and Rodrigo Vasquez produced a bottle of very good tequila from somewhere inside his coat, and Emmett Cole made a toast in the precise, careful language of a man who was a surveyor and not a poet, but who was genuinely moved and making his best effort. Ingrid Havorson cried, which surprised everyone, including Ingrid Havorson. Daniel ate enough supper for 2 adults and fell asleep in a chair before the evening was half over, and Jonas carried him out and put him in the wagon, and Matilda came and looked at the sleeping boy and felt something settle permanently in the center of her chest. They went home to her house, which was their house now, and she stood in the lamplight in her blue dress with her wild prairie flowers on the table, and Jonas Shepard took her hand and held it in both of his, just as he had across the courthouse table, and said nothing for a moment because there was nothing that needed saying. The seasons turned. The first full year of their marriage was busy and hard, and sometimes difficult and frequently wonderful. Jonas ran his cattle on the combined northern pasture they had discussed from the saddle, the natural logic of adjacent land becoming what it was always suited to be. Matilda ran her southern acres with her crew, planting and harvesting, and managing the account books with the same practical intelligence she had brought to her father's tailoring shop in St. Louis, which now served an altogether grander enterprise. She learned to ride well, genuinely well, not just adequately. She had been adequate when she arrived in Kansas and had quietly found it embarrassing, and had spent the winter working with Jonas in the evenings until she was not merely competent but good. Jonas was a patient teacher, with animals and with people, and had the particular gift of explaining things in a way that built the learner's own confidence rather than creating dependence on the teacher. In the summer of 1880, their son was born. They named him Earl for her father, and he came into the world on a hot August morning with the specific stubbornness of a person who intends to do things his own way from the first moment, which Jonas said meant he would be a great deal of work, and Matilda said meant he would be interesting. Daniel, who was 11 now, and had been carefully informed over the preceding months about the forthcoming brother, took his new role as older brother with the same serious gravity he brought to all significant responsibilities. He would sit beside Matilda when she was feeding young Earl and watch with an expression that was equal parts fascination and duty, as though he were learning a skill he intended to master. He was gentle with the baby in a way that his father recognized, the careful tenderness of someone who understands that small things require particular care. Jonas watched his family around the supper table in the evenings, Daniel talking about the colt he was training, Matilda with Earl against her shoulder, the lamplight warm and steady, the prairie dark and vast outside the windows, and felt things he had learned not to expect to feel again, things he had boxed away in the drawer alongside his grandmother's ring, and he was grateful with the whole of himself. And he said so to Matilda on a quiet evening on the porch when the children were asleep and the stars were enormous overhead. "I didn't know it could be like this," he said. "After Clara, I thought that was the one version of it I was going to get." Matilda sat beside him in the second chair he'd built for the porch when they moved in, a detail she had always loved, that he had built 2 chairs from the beginning. "Just in case," he'd said, and she had understood what he meant. She looked at the stars and thought about what he'd said. "Do you think Clara would have minded?" she asked. It was the question she had never asked before, and it was the right time for it now, in the dark with the stars and the quiet and nothing between them requiring management. He thought about it honestly. "No," he said. "Clara was generous. She would have wanted Daniel to have a mother. She would have wanted me to be happy." A pause. "She would have liked you, I think. She was practical like you. She didn't have much patience for nonsense." "High praise," Matilda said. He reached over and took her hand in the dark. "Highest," he said. The years moved through them in the way that good years do, not slowly and not quickly, but with the full weight of seasons and work and growth. Caldwell grew. The cattle trade shifted. The railroad came through in 1881, not across Matilda's land, which was now fully secured and beyond the company's reach, but along a route to the west that made the town busier and louder, and somewhat more complicated in the way that towns become when commerce arrives with its attendant ambitions. Fletcher Kane did not return. The federal case against the Transcontinental Land and Mineral Company resulted, in 1882, in a formal censure and a significant fine. And while the company continued to operate, its appetite for the specific tactics it had employed in Sumner County was substantially diminished by the federal attention. Emmett Cole retired from surveying and opened a small law office in Caldwell, using the knowledge of land disputes he had accumulated over 20 years to help the smaller landowners who could not otherwise afford legal counsel. He consulted with Jonas and Matilda on several cases and charged them nothing. Rodrigo Vasquez never got his quarter section back. The land was already sold and built upon by the time the federal case concluded, and the specific legal redress available to him was inadequate to the actual wrong. Matilda found this injustice unacceptable, and said so clearly and loudly, and continued to say so in every appropriate venue for years, though the mechanism for addressing it remained frustratingly limited. What she could do, she did. She hired Rodrigo's second son, Manuel, as a full-time hand on a permanent basis, paid him well, and gave him a stake in the operation that was real and not symbolic. It was not enough. She knew it was not enough, but she did it. In 1883, Daniel, who was 14 and had been working alongside his father since he was old enough to be useful, announced with the directness that came naturally to someone raised by 2 direct people that he wanted to be a doctor. Jonas looked at him across the supper table. Matilda looked at him. Daniel looked back at both of them with the particular composure of someone who has thought this through. "Why?" Jonas asked. "Because when Mama was sick last winter," Daniel said, using the word easily now, "and Doc Hennessy came, he knew what to do and it worked. I want to know how to do that." He meant the lung fever Matilda had caught in December of 1882, and which had frightened everyone badly for about 10 days before she had made a spirited recovery, that the doctor attributed partly to her constitution and partly, he said with professional understatement, to her absolute refusal to stay in bed as instructed. Jonas had sat beside her every night for those 10 days, and she had made him go sleep on the 4th day when it was clear she was improving, and he had been unable to sleep regardless. "A doctor," Jonas said now, looking at his son. "Yes," Daniel said. Jonas looked at Matilda. She looked at Jonas. They had a conversation with no words in the way that people who have shared years of practical decisions develop between them. "There's a medical college in St. Louis," Matilda said. "I know that city. I can write letters." "You'd have to go east first for proper schooling," Jonas said to Daniel. "College prep." "I know," Daniel said. "I've been reading about it." Jonas looked at his son for a long time with an expression that was a mixture of things: pride, and the specific ache of a parent watching a child aim toward a horizon, and something else, something quieter and older, which was gratitude for having a son worth being proud of. "Then we'll figure it out," Jonas said. Young Earl, who was 3 and had been listening to this conversation with the focused attention he brought to things he did not yet understand, said, "I want to be a horse," which broke the gravity of the moment completely. Life was full. In 1884, a second child came, a daughter they named Clara, which was Jonas's suggestion and Matilda's immediate agreement, and which Daniel greeted with the solemn tenderness of someone who understood the significance of the name and took it seriously. She was born in February, in the warmth of their house with the prairie cold pressing against the windows, and she was small and strong, and from the beginning had a quality of absolute certainty about her own preferences that made Jonas look at Matilda with an expression of loving resignation. "She's yours," he said. "She is her own person," Matilda said firmly, and then to the infant in her arms, "Aren't you?" Clara appeared to agree, with the small absolute conviction she already had about everything. Earl, who was 4, was suspicious of his new sister for approximately 2 weeks, and then decided she was acceptable, primarily because she was responsive to sound, and he discovered that if he made a particular noise she would look at him, which he found deeply satisfying. Daniel came home for Christmas that year from the academy in Kansas City, where he was doing his college preparatory studies, and he was taller than Jonas by half an inch, and had a focused, serious quality about him that was new and very recognizable. He sat at the supper table and asked informed questions about the ranch operations, about the cattle market, about the family's finances, and Jonas answered all of them and felt the particular complicated emotion of watching a child becoming a person you would choose to know regardless of relation. After supper, Daniel held Clara with careful competence, the medical student's practical comfort with small bodies, and Earl told him at length about everything that had happened since his last visit, which was a great deal, including the time a coyote had gotten into the chicken coop, and Mama had gone after it with a broom. Jonas gave Matilda a look from across the room, and she gave him one back, and the unspoken conversation was brief and clear. They were happy. They were genuinely, completely, practically happy, not in the way of stories where happiness is a kind of glowing absence of difficulty, but in the way of real life, where happiness is the feeling you have when you look around at what you've built and what you love and know that it is worth the work it took. In the spring of 1885, Jonas and Matilda rode out together on a Sunday morning when Thomas had the children and the hands were off for the day, and they rode the full perimeter of their combined land, both properties together, which was over 700 acres now, including a section Jonas had purchased from a neighbor who was moving north. They rode it slowly, stopping where there was something worth stopping for, talking when they wanted to talk and quiet when they wanted that. At the top of the North Rise, where the land showed itself most fully in both directions, they stopped their horses and looked out. It was a bright May morning, the grass deep green and moving in the wind, the creek catching sun in the south, the tree line dark and solid along the north boundary, the sky that enormous Kansas sky above everything going on without end. "Tell me what you see," Jonas said. It was what she had asked him to do on the very first day at this same basic stretch of country 6 years and a lifetime ago. She looked at it for a long time. "Good soil in the south quarter," she said, with a smile in her voice. "Creeks reliable except in August, sometimes July if it's dry. North section has rocky ground but it drains well, and there's a natural windbreak in the tree line that shelters the house site nicely. The grass comes in strong in a good year." She paused. "And it's mine," she added. "Ours, built and kept and worth every fight." He leaned over from his saddle and she leaned toward him, and he kissed her in the May morning above their land. And when they pulled back, his hand was in her hair and her hand was on his arm. And the sky went on forever above them, and the grass moved, and the creek caught the light, and everything was, at this moment, in this particular sweep of time, entirely and completely right. They rode down together into the green, moving land, side by side, the horses easy and unhurried, and behind them the rise held the morning light for a long time after they had descended into the valley. Young Earl grew into a boy of tremendous energy and genuine kindness, which was an unusual combination that served him well. He loved animals with a specific, consuming passion that was more than the ordinary affection of a ranch child, and by the time he was 7, he had befriended every horse on the property individually and could tell them apart by sound from inside the house. He would have been content to live in the barn and required regular extracting. Jonas said he had never seen anything like it. Matilda said he had her father's heart, which was a thing she meant as the highest possible compliment. Clara grew into her certainty. She was decisive in a way that was occasionally difficult and frequently useful, and she learned to read at 4 with the focused efficiency of someone who has identified a skill and intends to acquire it without delay. She read everything available, which on a working ranch was not unlimited, and Matilda began ordering books from a catalog house in Kansas City, both for Clara and because she had not stopped reading herself and never intended to. Daniel finished his preparatory studies in 1887 and was accepted to a medical college in St. Louis, which was the city Matilda had come from, and which she helped him navigate in letters that were partly maternal and partly the completely practical guide of someone who knew the city's streets and its rhythms. He went with Jonas's handshake and Matilda's embrace and Earl's specific instruction that he should bring back something good, and Clara's calm observation that he should write. He wrote good letters, detailed and specific about his studies, about the cases he observed, about the professors who were excellent and the ones who were not, and Matilda and Jonas read them at the supper table in the evenings and passed them to each other, and Jonas filed every one of them in the box that had once held his grandmother's ring and now held different kinds of treasure. In 1888, Emmett Cole died at 72, which was a full age for the territory, and which came quietly in his sleep in a manner everyone agreed was appropriate for a man who had spent his life being precise and careful. Matilda attended the service in Caldwell and sat in the second row and thought about the man who had surveyed the land and kept the records and told the truth in the courthouse when it was not the easy thing to do. She put flowers on his grave afterward, prairie flowers from her own land, and said thank you, which was what she had been saying to him in various forms since 1878, and which remained true. The end of the decade came with its own texture and color. The cattle market shifted again. The frontier was changing, settling, becoming something more institutional and less wild. The specific lawlessness that had allowed men like Fletcher Kane to operate with impunity was narrowing under federal law and territorial administration, and the simple accumulation of people and community that makes certain behaviors no longer tenable. Jonas and Matilda were not rich, but they were stable and clear-eyed and deeply rooted. They had made their land into something productive and lasting. They had built something worth building. In the summer of 1889, Jonas came home from a day working the far north section, with a look on his face that Matilda had learned to identify as something requiring attention, not concern exactly, but a quality of serious inward consideration. "What happened?" she asked. "Nothing bad," he said. He sat down at the kitchen table and looked at his hands for a moment in the way he sometimes did when he was finding the right way to say something. "I was up at the north tree line today," he said, "working on the fence where it dropped, and I stood there for a minute and thought about the day we rode the boundary in May, and I thought—" He paused. She waited. "I thought that Earl Hart never saw this land," he said, "and he should have. He imagined it well enough that his daughter came out here and built it into something real, but he never saw it." She was quiet, looking at him. "I want to build something, Jonas said. "Something permanent that marks what this land is and who it belongs to and where it came from. I don't know exactly what yet, but something." She thought about this for a long moment. Outside, Earl was in the yard with the horses, which was his natural habitat, and Clara's voice came from the other room where she was reading with a quality of total absorption. The house was warm and solid around them. "There's a place on the south rise," Matilda said slowly, "where you can see the whole property in both directions, where the creek catches the light." "Yes," he said. "We could plant a tree there," she said. "A big one, something that will outlast us both. Put a stone beside it with his name." Jonas looked at her with his dark eyes that she had come to know as well as anything she knew in the world. "Earl Hart," he said. "Earl Hart," she agreed, "who bought this land on a map in a kitchen in St. Louis and dreamed it well enough that it became real. They planted an oak tree on the south rise in the autumn of 1889. It was a modest sapling, barely taller than Earl, which prompted their son to point out with irony that it was named for two people now. They set a flat limestone marker beside it with the name chiseled in cleanly. Earl Hart, who dreamed this land into being. Rodrigo Vasquez came with his family and helped plant it, and Thomas was there, and Manuel and Pete, who was 29 now with a wife and 2 children of his own, and old Calhoun, who was not precisely old but had earned the adjective through years of useful labor and honest service, and who stood at the edge of the group, and watched with the satisfaction of a man who has been part of a thing that turned out well. The sapling took hold and grew through the following years with the persistence of something correctly placed, something planted where it was supposed to be. By the time Earl Jr. was 15 and Clara was 10, it was tall enough to provide real shade and visible from the house on clear mornings. Daniel came home in 1892 as a fully qualified physician, which was a moment of such significance that even Jonas, who was not a demonstrative man outside of private moments, was seen to have something in his eyes that required clearing when Daniel shook his hand in the yard. Daniel set up practice in Caldwell, which had grown considerably by then, and needed a second doctor, and he lived in the town, but came out to the ranch on Sundays in the habit they had established years ago, bringing medical journals that he and Matilda discussed with the focused intensity of two people who find learning naturally interesting. He was not, at 23, someone who showed obvious signs of the boy who had once stood in a barn and asked a woman if she could bake, but Matilda saw it in his eyes when he talked about his patients, the same focused care with which he had measured flour and thought about textures, and presented biscuits with professional satisfaction. He had always wanted to know how things worked and how to fix them when they didn't. That part of him had not changed. He also, in the spring of 1893, met and began courting a woman named Ruth Alvarez, the schoolteacher in Caldwell, who was 22 and possessed of a particular combination of warmth and sharpness that Matilda recognized immediately as the kind of person who would be good for a person like Daniel. She told Jonas this on the evening after meeting Ruth for the first time. "How can you tell?" he asked. "Because she disagrees with him when he's wrong," Matilda said, "and he listens." Jonas thought about this. "That's how I should have known about you," he said. "You did know," she said. "The second week, you said." He smiled, which was still the thing that transformed his face, though she had seen it thousands of times now and it still did. "The second week," he confirmed. They were 48 and 41 now, Jonas and Matilda, and the years on them were visible in the good way, the way of people who have lived in honest proportion to their circumstances. Jonas's hair was silver at the temples and his face had deepened in its weather lines, and Matilda's hair had streaks of gray that she made no effort to conceal, because she had earned them and knew it. They were still the people who had sat across from each other at a small table in a lantern-lit cabin and talked about forged documents and the specific corruption of men with too much money and too little conscience. They were also the people who had kissed on a north rise in May above a green valley and felt the sky going on forever. They were both things simultaneously, which was what it meant to be people who had built something together through time. Daniel and Ruth were married in 1894 in the same Methodist church in Caldwell, and Matilda sat in the front pew beside Jonas and held his hand and looked at her stepson at the altar with his direct eyes and his serious face, and thought about biscuits and a Dutch oven and a boy who had wanted to know if she could bake. And Jonas felt her hand tighten slightly on his and looked at her, and she shook her head with a small smile that meant not now. I'll tell you later. And he squeezed back and looked forward, and they sat in the good, warm forward motion of their life. Earl, by 17, had developed into a young man of remarkable equestrian skill and a natural affinity for animal husbandry that Matilda eventually stopped trying to redirect into other channels and simply began to formally develop. He was not going to be a doctor or a teacher or a lawyer. He was going to be what his landscape and his inclinations had been shaping him to be since he could walk: a horseman, a rancher, a keeper of animals, the next iteration of what his parents had built. Clara, at 15, was reading law books borrowed from Emmett Cole's old collection, which Emmett's nephew had kept and which no one in Caldwell found a use for, and asking questions in the focused, precise way of someone who intends to go somewhere with the information. There was no law school that admitted women in Kansas in 1894. Matilda knew this and Clara knew it. They also both knew that this was a condition of the present moment and not necessarily of the future. And Matilda wrote letters on her daughter's behalf to women's academies and legal societies, and anyone she could find who might know of a path, because she had learned in 1878 that paths that do not yet exist can sometimes be made. The ranch in 1895 was a working, thriving enterprise of 740 acres under combined Shepard management, with a reliable herd, a well-maintained property, 2 full-time hands plus seasonal workers, and account books that were always balanced and frequently showed the pleasant surplus of a well-managed operation. Matilda managed the books. Jonas managed the cattle. Earl managed the horses, officially now. Thomas, who was still with them after 17 years, managed everything else with the quiet competence that had always been his defining characteristic. On an evening in October of 1895, when the prairie was going amber and the nights were getting cold, and the oak tree on the south rise was showing its autumn color, Jonas and Matilda sat on their porch in the 2 chairs he had built when they moved in, which were worn now and comfortable in the specific way of things that have been sat in by the same people for a long time. The sky was doing its enormous prairie sunset, pink and gold and ridiculous in its beauty, and the cattle were moving in the south pasture toward the water, and somewhere Earl was whistling to the horses in the barn, and the house behind them had lamplight already coming from Clara's window where she would be reading. "Tell me what you see," Matilda said. He looked at the land for a long time, the creek catching the last light, the oak tree on the rise, tall now and full in its autumn color, the long golden grass. "The enormous sky, everything I thought I was done expecting," he said. She put her hand over his on the arm of his chair, and he turned his palm up and held it, warm and certain and exactly as it had been across the oak table in the courthouse in 1878, except that now there was no hearing and no bruise and no forced choice between letting go and holding on, only the choice they had been making every day since, which was to stay, to build, to hold on. The sun went down over their land and the stars came out one by one, and they sat in the dark with the horses and the cattle and the night birds and the deep particular silence of the prairie that is not empty but entirely full, and they were home, and they were together, and everything they had fought for and built and kept was real and present and enduring around them. Rooted as deep in this Kansas ground as the oak tree that grew for a man who had dreamed it from a kitchen table in St. Louis, and a woman who had come west to make the dream true, and had found, along the way, more than she had come looking for. The oak tree grew, the land kept, the family continued, and Jonas Shepard held Matilda Hart's hand in the dark above their valley, and he did not let go.